The Empire purchased a decommissioned human destroyer. It still had the weapons active. Procurement Minister Haldan Vray had spent 30 years building the Vessarine Empire's reputation for getting the better end of every trade, and the auction listing that crossed his desk that morning looked, to his considerable satisfaction, like precisely the kind of deal his reputation was built on. A Terran-built destroyer, the UES Kestrel Bay, decommissioned after 11 years of frontier patrol service, offered through a legitimate human surplus auction at a fraction of what a comparable Vessarine warship would cost to build from keel to launch. The listing specified standard decommissioning protocol, weapons systems stripped, reactor core downrated to civilian output limits, and all classified targeting software wiped in accordance with Terran export regulations. Vray authorized the purchase within the hour. Even stripped of its weapons, a hull that size, built to Terran hull plating standards the Empire had never fully managed to replicate, was worth the price simply for the engineering data his research division would extract from studying it firsthand. The Kestrel Bay arrived at Vessarine Shipyard 3 weeks later, towed in on a slow civilian transit lane by its skeleton human delivery crew, who handled the handoff with brisk professional courtesy and departed within 2 hours of docking, citing a tight return schedule. Fleet engineer Decommissioned walked the ship's length personally that first day, running her hands along hull plating that felt, even through her environment suit, subtly different from anything Vessarine engineering had ever produced, denser in places that made no structural sense until she considered that it might be layered rather than solid, and immediately began drafting the research proposal that would occupy her division for the next several months. Reactors confirmed downrated, her junior technician reported, 3 days into the initial inspection. Output matches civilian specification exactly, well within what the auction listing promised. Weapons bays are empty, just like they said. This is a clean hull, chief engineer. Better than clean, honestly. Whoever decommissioned this ship did a thorough job of it. There had been one small oddity even in those first weeks, one that Corin herself had noted and then, like most of her team, quietly set aside. The Kestrel Bay's internal power distribution grid, mapped in full during the initial inspection, showed a handful of conduits running to compartments that the official schematic listed as simple storage, thick cabling for spaces that, according to every document the Terran auction house had provided, held nothing more than spare parts and emergency rations. Corin had flagged it in her own notes as an inefficiency in the ship's original design, the kind of redundant wiring that sometimes survived multiple refits simply because nobody had bothered to strip it out, and had moved on to more pressing structural analysis. It would be 5 more months before that particular note resurfaced in her thinking, and by then it would read less like an oversight and more like the one thread she should have pulled on immediately. Corin found herself agreeing, at the time, without much reservation. The Kestrel Bay's weapons bays were, by every scan her team ran, genuinely empty, its targeting software genuinely wiped, its reactor genuinely capped at the modest output level the listing had promised. It would take her division another 4 months of deeper structural analysis before anyone noticed the detail that would eventually unravel the entire purchase, and by that point, the ship had already been formally integrated into the Empire's auxiliary fleet as a training and engineering study vessel, crewed by a rotating complement of Vessarine officers eager for hands-on experience with genuine Terran hull architecture. It was a junior structural analyst named Perrin Bosk who found it, 6 months after the Kestrel Bay's arrival, while conducting a routine internal survey ahead of a planned refit that would strip several redundant compartments to make room for Vessarine sensor arrays. Buried behind a section of bulkhead paneling that read, on every scan, as solid structural support, Bosk's handheld density scanner returned a result that didn't match anything a support bulkhead should contain. "Chief Engineer, I need you to look at this," Bosk said, standing in a narrow maintenance corridor 3 decks below the Kestrel Bay's main hull, staring at a scanner readout he had already checked twice. "This bulkhead section is reading as hollow. Internally hollow, with a density gradient that doesn't match any structural material I recognize." Corin arrived within the hour, and the two of them spent the better part of an afternoon carefully removing enough panel sections to expose what lay behind the bulkhead, working with the particular caution of engineers who had already begun to suspect they were about to find something the original decommissioning inspection had missed entirely. What they found, sealed inside a compartment that had never appeared on a single deck schematic the Terran auction house had provided, was a weapons control node, fully intact, fully wired into ship systems that had been marked as stripped, and when Corin's team cautiously ran a passive diagnostic, very clearly still receiving standby power from somewhere the reactor's official output logs had no record of accounting for. "This isn't a fault in the decommissioning process," Corin said quietly, staring at the exposed node. "This is a second reactor. A shielded one, built into the hull architecture itself, running completely independent of the primary reactor we've been monitoring for 6 months. Someone built this ship with a hidden power source specifically designed to survive a standard decommissioning inspection undetected. The discovery went up the Empire's command chain within the day, and by the following week, Minister Vray found himself standing in a briefing room with Fleet Command, watching a live feed from inside the Kestrel Bay's hidden compartment while a visibly uncomfortable Corin walked them through 6 months of readings that, in hindsight, had contained warning signs nobody had thought to connect.
The reactor down rate we confirmed on arrival was genuine, as far as it went, Corin explained.
But it only accounted for the ship's primary, publicly listed power core. This secondary system was built directly into structural elements the auction listing described as inert support material, shielded well enough that even our deep hull scans read it as solid plating rather than active machinery. We weren't looking for a second reactor, Minister, because nothing in the sale documentation suggested one could exist. We were looking for evidence the stripped systems had actually been stripped, and by every measure we knew to check, they had been.
Fleet Admiral Frex Carnavan, seated at the head of the table, asked the question that mattered most. Are the weapons functional? Corin hesitated only briefly. We haven't dared run a live activation test, Admiral, for obvious reasons. But the standby power signature is consistent, stable, and has been running continuously since the ship's arrival 6 months ago, which tells us it wasn't triggered by anything we did. It was simply always on, quietly, the entire time we've had officers training aboard this vessel. She paused. Sir, I think we need to consider the possibility that this ship's targeting software was never actually wiped either. It may simply have been wiped from every system we knew to check. The Empire's diplomatic office lodged a formal protest with the Terran Trade Consortium within 48 hours, demanding explanation and, implicitly, some acknowledgement of wrongdoing serious enough to justify voiding the sale. The response, when it arrived 5 days later, came not from the consortium's legal division but from a single named representative, a woman identified only as Director Amara Osei, whose message was addressed directly to Minister Vray and copied to the full Fleet Command roster. Minister Vray, the message began, I've reviewed your protest regarding the UES Kestrel Bay, and I want to address it directly, because I think there's a misunderstanding here worth clearing up before this escalates further than it needs to. The Kestrel Bay was decommissioned exactly as advertised, by every standard our own regulatory framework requires for civilian surplus sale. Weapons systems stripped from primary architecture, reactor downrated to civilian specification, targeting software wiped from all systems documented in the ship's official schematic. Every claim in that listing was true. A pause, evident even in text. What wasn't specified, because it has never been standard practice for us to specify it, is that Terran naval architecture has included redundant, independently shielded weapons and power infrastructure in every hull built for frontier patrol duty for the last several decades. This isn't a flaw in your purchase, Minister. It's a design standard, present in every Terran warship your Empire has ever purchased through legitimate surplus channels, and very likely present in several you haven't yet discovered. The room went very quiet as an aide read the final line of the message aloud a second time, ensuring everyone present had understood it correctly. Minister Vray felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the briefing room. She's telling us, he said slowly, that this isn't the only ship. I believe that's precisely what she's telling us, Minister, Admiral Carnavan said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man recalculating an entire fleet inventory in his head. We've purchased 6 Terran surplus vessels over the last 4 years, through the same consortium, under the same auction process. Nobody in the room needed to finish the thought aloud. 6 hulls, potentially 6 hidden reactors, 6 sets of weapons systems that had passed every inspection the Empire's engineering corps knew how to run, sitting quietly in Vessarine shipyards and training fleets, integrated into the Empire's own auxiliary operations for years in some cases, each one a possibility nobody had thought to check because nobody had ever suspected the checking itself was incomplete by design. Minister Vray's formal response to Osei's message, drafted over the following 3 days with input from the Empire's full legal and military leadership, requested a joint inspection protocol, developed with Terran cooperation, to verify the true status of every surplus vessel currently in Vessarine service. The response that came back was, by the standards of interstellar diplomatic correspondence, almost startlingly direct. We'll provide inspection protocols for the 6 vessels currently in question, Osei wrote, and I'd recommend your engineering corps use them carefully, because they're the only reliable way to distinguish a genuinely stripped hull from one built the way ours are built. But I want to be clear about something, Minister, because I think it matters more than the inspection itself. We're not going to stop building our warships this way, and we're not going to stop selling decommissioned hulls through legitimate surplus channels either. Both of those things can be true at once.
What I'd suggest, going forward, is that any government purchasing Terran military surplus factor this design standard into its own risk assessment, rather than assuming a stripped listing means what it would mean coming from your own shipyards. We're not hiding anything from you that isn't already true of every ship we've ever sold. We're simply not in the habit of explaining our own architecture to buyers who never asked. The joint inspection, conducted 6 weeks later aboard all 6 vessels, confirmed exactly what Corin's team had found aboard the Kestrel Bay: hidden reactors in 4 of the 6 hulls, dormant weapons infrastructure in 3, and in one particularly uncomfortable case, a training vessel that had been hosting live cadet exercises for over a year with a fully intact secondary targeting system running quietly behind a bulkhead nobody had ever thought to open. Minister Vray stood on the observation deck of Shipyard 7 several months later, watching engineering crews carefully catalogue the Kestrel Bay's newly exposed systems under a joint Terran-Vessarine oversight agreement that had taken considerable diplomatic effort to negotiate, and found himself thinking about the auction listing that had crossed his desk nearly a year earlier, the one he had authorized so quickly, so confidently, certain he had gotten the better end of an easy trade. 30 years in procurement, he said quietly to Corin, who had joined him on the deck, and I never once considered that the ship being cheap and the ship being safe might not be the same thing at all. Corin watched the crews working below, careful and slow around infrastructure none of them had fully mapped even now. I don't think it's about cheap or safe, Minister, she said. I think it's that we assumed a stripped ship meant a ship with nothing left to hide, because that's what stripping a ship means for us. They just build differently than we do, from the very first plate they lay down. We were never buying a decommissioned destroyer, Minister. We were buying a ship that had simply decided not to show us what it still was. In the months following the joint inspection, Per Vosk, the junior analyst whose stubborn insistence on double-checking a strange density reading had started the entire discovery, found himself reassigned to a newly created oversight division tasked specifically with reviewing every prior Terran surplus purchase the Empire had ever made across 4 decades of trade relations. It was slow, unglamorous work, cataloging schematics against physical scans on ships that had, in some cases, been in Vessarine service for over 20 years without incident. Vosk did not mind the tedium. He had learned, in that narrow maintenance corridor 6 decks below the Kestrel Bay's hull, that the difference between a routine inspection and a genuine discovery usually came down to whether someone was willing to keep looking after the official answer had already satisfied everyone else in the room, and he intended to keep looking for as long as the division would have him. Fleet Admiral Carnavan, for his part, used the incident to push through a fleet-wide policy the Empire's more traditional officers had resisted for years: mandatory independent verification of any acquired hull's power architecture before integration into active or training service, regardless of the seller's documentation or reputation. It was an expensive policy, and an unpopular one among procurement officers who had grown comfortable trusting established trade relationships, but Carnavan found the political capital to push it through easily enough once the full scope of the Kestrel Bay's hidden systems had circulated through Fleet Command. We were treating decommissioning paperwork as a description of the ship, he told the assembled officer corps at the policy's formal announcement. It was never that. It was a description of what the seller was willing to show us. Those are not the same document, and I do not intend for this fleet to make that mistake a second time. Director Osei's office, for its part, issued no further formal statements on the matter beyond the initial inspection protocols already provided, and continued processing surplus sales through the same consortium channels exactly as before. A quiet addendum did appear in the consortium's public sale documentation roughly a year later, a single new clause buried in the standard terms that Vray's legal division noticed almost immediately, informing prospective buyers that all Terran naval hulls, decommissioned or otherwise, might retain design features not detailed in individual sale listings, and that purchasers should conduct independent verification accordingly. It was, as far as anyone in the Empire's diplomatic corps could tell, the closest thing to an apology or an explanation the Terrans intended to offer, and it was, Vray privately admitted to Corin over the following weeks, entirely sufficient, because it told him everything he actually needed to know going forward. The ships would keep looking exactly as advertised, and the Empire would simply have to decide, every single time, how much of that advertisement it was willing to trust. Vray said nothing for a long moment, watching the slow careful work continue below, 6 hulls worth of quiet lessons the Empire would spend the next decade absorbing into every future acquisition it ever made from Terran hands again.